If your child vanished into the deep forest, and no one believed she was still alive, what would you do? That night, as the rain thundered down, all Mara had left was a tiny braid of hair and a deep, low thrum echoing from the edge of the woods. The truth no one dared to say was this: some forests don't take, they keep. No tracks, no signs. Yet each morning, a silent gift appeared on her porch. A spoon carved from bone, a braid of nettle, a piece of alder etched with a roofline. I've followed 23 missing persons cases in the forests of Oregon. Only this one made me believe. Not everyone who disappears is lost. Some are chosen. In this story, you'll learn how a child survived 9 years in silence, raised by someone beyond our maps. You'll see how a mother held on not with screams, but with tiny rituals of care. A nettle knot, a clean stream, a quiet offering. And you'll witness how nature repaid her, not with miracles, but with presence. Willa came back at 14, strong and quiet. She grew up inside a song of wind and stone, and returned not because she was found, but because she chose. Her heart beat in rhythm with the earth's. If you believe there's still wonder in this world, don't skip this. Because some families aren't made by blood or name. They're built in silence and held together when the river rises. The morning rose soft and pale above the rim of Willamette National Forest, its light slipping through alder branches like a hush. The air was still cool from spring's retreat, and the last mist of thawed floods clung to the ground in silver threads. A wood smoke tang floated faintly, trailing from the low chimney of a small, hand-built cabin nestled just past the tree line, where cedar-shook roof met morning fog, and the creek sang its distant song through the bramble. Inside, under the frame of a moss-chinked window, 2 sets of hands worked quietly, one weathered, one tiny. Mara Jean Harlow sat cross-legged on a round wool mat, a bundle of stinging nettle stems across her lap, the sting already drawn from them by drying, her palms calloused and sure. Her daughter, Willa, barely 3 years old, perched on a low bench beside her, eyes wide as pond glass, following the rhythm of her mother's fingers. Mara twisted the long green fibers gently, then passed the strand to Willa, guiding the girl's fingers over and under, around and through. 1 loop for thanks, Mara whispered. 2 loops for care. Willa's little mouth made a circle as she whispered the words back, her breath clouding on the window pane. She fumbled but tried again, a knot this time forming, clumsy but honest. Mara smiled softly. That one'll do. She took the finished knot, looped it through twine, and tied it to a nail beneath the window's ledge. The knot swayed just slightly, catching light. Gratitude suspended. They called it a thank you knot. Every morning they made one, with whatever was at hand. Nettles, willow bark, sometimes even dry grass twisted tight. Mara believed it mattered. You took from the forest, you gave something back. Not money, not words, just care. That was the law she kept, since before Willa was born, since even before the accident that left her with more quiet than company. She didn't speak of the mill fire anymore. Only the wind seemed to remember. Outside, the forest stirred. Rain from last week's flood still lingered in the brush, though Brush Creek had calmed. Its swollen edges had pulled back into their bed, leaving silt and soft moss exposed along the bank. The hemlock stood taller now that the worst was over, shedding water in slow, patient droplets. Mara stepped into her boots. Willa's small hand already curled in hers, and together they walked the narrow trail leading behind the cabin. A woven basket hung from Mara's elbow, empty save for a folded scrap of cloth and a sprig of lavender tied with twine. Willa carried a bundle of yarrow and plantain leaves, both gathered the day before. The girl held them like a gift. At the base of the oldest hemlock, its roots fanning wide, soil dark and damp with memory, they stopped. Mara knelt first, brushing away a few pine needles, and Willa mimicked her, pressing the leaves down gently into the ground as if tucking them in for rest. "This is for healing," Mara murmured. "For whoever needs it next." Willa nodded solemnly. "For the deer," she said. Mara didn't correct her. A jay shrieked in the distance, then fell quiet. The forest held still a moment too long. Mara rose slowly, eyes sweeping the sand-colored edge of the bank, where last week the water had rushed wild and fast. Now the edge was soft again, the footprints of yesterday washed clean. Except one. Just off to the right of Willa's bare prints was another, slightly larger but not by much. Oddly shaped. No tread, no boot edge. Just 5 long toes, each splayed like a fan. The heel was deep. And it was alone. No others trailed in or out. Just that one, half faded, already softening as the wind pulled at the sand. Mara stared for a beat too long. Willa chased a butterfly nearby. Then, just like that, a gust stirred the trees and scattered the edges of the print into nothing. She didn't say anything. Just bent to check Willa's shoes, brushed a twig from the girl's sweater, and turned them both back toward the cabin. But something lingered behind her rib cage, something low and hollow, like a knock too deep to echo. That night, as the mist thickened again and the creek hissed faintly through the dark, Mara moved slow through her evening tasks. She boiled water in the dented copper kettle, pressed herbs between pages of a worn-out field book, and stitched by lantern light the hem of Willa's wool sweater, the one with the right sleeve unraveling. Her needle moved steady, but her eyes shimmered, glassy with something she couldn't name. Not fear, not quite. A knowing, maybe. A worry without shape. Outside the window, the thank you knot swung gently. The wind had quieted, but the thread moved as if something unseen had brushed past. The lantern flickered. Willa had fallen asleep early, curled beneath the old quilt, her braid loosened and face flushed from sun. Mara kissed her forehead, tucked a bundle of dried mint near the pillow. Then she returned to the table, fingers brushing across the low wooden surface, smoothed by years of use. This table, she'd built herself. Like the stove hearth, the window frame, the low bench, the shelves that held clay jars and baskets and folded cloth. All shaped from her hands, all part of the same promise: if you take something, you tend to it. You honor it, even if no one sees, especially then. Sometime past midnight, the forest hummed. Not with crickets or owls or wind, but with something deeper, so low it wasn't quite heard, only felt. It passed through the wooden beams of the cabin, through the floorboards, up through the soles of her feet, and into her chest, where it settled. A tremor, a rhythm. 3 slow pulses, almost like breath. Not threatening, not random, like a lullaby meant for the earth itself. Mara held still. Even the kettle seemed to hush. Outside, beyond the reach of the oil lamp's glow, the trees did not sway. But somewhere in the dark, something was listening, or watching, or both. The knot by the window stopped moving, then started again, slightly, as if tugged once, then nothing. Morning came pale and gold. The frost had lifted early, and the edges of the yard glistened with dew. Willa was up before Mara, already perched by the window, looking out. "Mama," she whispered, "somebody left pine cones on the step." Mara came to look. 3 small cones, each lined in a row, just under the overhang. No raccoon did that. Not wind either. They weren't there last night. She opened the door slow, looked out at the trail. No tracks, no smell but earth and wood smoke and sun-warmed moss. She crouched to touch one cone, then stood and said nothing. Willa just hummed quietly, swinging her legs against the bench. Later that day, Mara reached for the nettles again. Willa helped. They twisted the fibers with more ease this time, the child's hands learning faster. The new thank you knot was tighter, smaller, cleaner. A good sign. Mara held it up to the light, then tied it on a new nail, just beneath yesterday's. The breeze caught it gently. It moved in small circles, dancing against the window pane. Something in her chest shifted again, like the knot had tied more than just fiber. She didn't know, not yet, that someone else, something else, had seen her teach Willa that morning ritual, had heard the words, had watched the care, had started to understand, but she would, because care, like sound, travels. And in the forest, nothing truly goes unnoticed. The rain didn't wait for thunder that afternoon. It came sharp, sudden, heavy, sheets of water pouring out of a sky that had turned the color of a bruised apple. Just moments before, the air still held a softness, like it hadn't made up its mind yet. The trees along Brush Creek barely had time to shudder before the storm opened its mouth and swallowed sound. Mara had her hands in the wash basin near the back steps, rinsing a tin pot from breakfast, the scent of rosemary and ash clinging to her sleeves. She'd only looked down for a second, wiping the rim with a cloth. When she looked up, Willa was gone. There wasn't a scream, not even a rustle. Just absence. Clean and immediate, like someone had cut her child out of the frame of the world. The kind of silence that steals the breath from your bones. Mara dropped the pot, her boots slapping hard against the wet planks as she bolted forward, eyes scanning the rain-heavy slope where Willa had been squatting minutes ago, playing with pebbles and a dandelion crown. She was nowhere. Only the dandelions remained, trampled, their stems split like veins underfoot. Mara's voice tore through the storm, but it barely carried. Willa's name vanished into wind. She ran downhill, past the alder stump, her fingers snagging against a blackberry thorn without feeling the cut. Her eyes darted, searching. The creek had swelled again. Water licked over the rocks now, fast and brown, with silt. And there, caught on a low branch, fluttered a strip of something pale, twisted and wet. Mara lunged toward it, heart drumming. It was a ribbon. One of Willa's braids had come undone. The strip was tied with nettle fiber. She clutched it tight in her fist, chest heaving. The bank was slick, nearly vertical in places. She slipped, knees hitting the mud, then scrambled up again, scanning for any shape, any trace. But the creek had no mercy. It took what it wanted and told nothing. She shouted again. No answer, just the current slapping against stones like frantic hands. Then, through the downpour, her eyes caught something just upstream, half hidden behind a curtain of willow branches. A structure. She hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't hers. It stood at the bend where the water ran deepest. A frame of alder wood lashed together, leaning into a wedge of stone. An A-frame, crude but sturdy. Not fallen branches. This was made, designed, meant to hold. She stepped closer, ignoring the ache in her shins. The frame had small stones wedged into the base, reinforcing it. Someone had built this. For what purpose, she couldn't guess. Shelter from the flood. A hiding place? The rain lashed at her back. She stared at the thing with narrowed eyes. Something in her gut shifted. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had known the water would come. By dusk, the search began. Flashlights pierced the tree trunks like stars shaken loose. Deputy Hank Trevino arrived with 2 others from the Vida outpost. Radios crackled. Dogs barked, eager and confused, circling the cabin's edge before scattering toward the trail. Mara stood in the storm-soaked doorway, soaked through, the strip of braid still clenched in her hand. She could barely speak, just kept pointing. "There," she said hoarse. "By the creek. She was there." The dogs reached the basalt near the bank and stopped. Turned. whined. The rock held no scent. The wind had taken it, or the water had erased it. Either way, the dogs were blind. Deputy Trevino knelt near the A-frame and ran his hand along the alder post. His eyes scanned the wedge of stones, the lack of moss on the inner side, the way the wood was newer than the surroundings. Built recently, he muttered. But by who? He asked Mara about visitors. She shook her head. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Just us. They combed the banks for hours. The creek mocked them. No signs, no trail. One of the deputies brought over a clump of leaves stuck near the roots upstream, broad and wet, with a strong, earthy scent. Skunk cabbage. A few torn cottonwood leaves mixed in. The dogs sneezed and lost the trail again. The scents overpowered everything else. Trevino noted it, logged it, then looked at Mara with tired eyes. We'll keep looking, he said, but without a clear trail. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mara didn't eat that night. She sat on the top step of the cabin, arms wrapped around herself. The rain had slowed to a mist, the wind settling into long breaths through the trees. Her fingers kept returning to the strip of braid. She untwisted it gently, examined the frayed ends of the nettle fiber. Her own hands had made that braid. Her own hands had pulled that nettle thread. A cold heaviness pressed behind her ribs. She should have heard something. A splash, a cry, anything. But the forest had been silent, as if it too were holding its breath. The lantern behind her flickered. She didn't go inside. The mist thickened. From somewhere deep in the trees, beyond the reach of human voice, came a sound so low it barely existed, like a vibration through the roots. A pulse that moved not through ears, but through marrow. 3 slow notes. A rhythm more than a sound, like the earth whispering back. Mara's breath caught. She closed her eyes, hand pressing to her chest where the hum had settled. The rhythm wasn't violent. It wasn't loud. It was soft, but certain. It filled her without permission. It made her think, not of loss, but of presence, of something watching from the edge of light. Not cruel at all. Only waiting. She opened her eyes again. The trees stood still. The air had gone cold. No more thunder, no more urgency, just a strange knowing that settled like silt after a storm. The deputy returned the next morning. He stood by the door, tapping his notebook. He didn't offer much. No sign of abduction. No witnesses. No one saw Willa swept away. No shoes left behind, no shirt, no hair. Just the ribbon. He wrote it down carefully. Missing. Presumed lost during flash flood. Pending further evidence. Mara didn't answer. She didn't cry. She just closed the door slowly. Inside, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The basket sat on the table, still damp from the rain. The lavender soaked and browning. The thank you knot from the day before hung limp under the window, threads tangled from wind. She untied it with slow fingers. Then, after a breath, reached for more nettle fibers. Her hands moved without thinking, looping the strands tighter this time, her fingers trembling slightly. She twisted the final knot with a pull that felt like a prayer clenched into form. She hung it in the same place, let it sway. It swayed once, then stilled. She didn't speak aloud, but her breath said it anyway. You're not gone. I know you're not gone. Because somewhere, just at the edge of what could be believed, something in the trees had answered. And not with cruelty, but with intention, with memory, with waiting. The sun had dried the moss. That's how Mara knew summer was starting to settle in. The green had lost its shimmer along the fence posts, and the hemlock bark had turned to rust in the low light. Crickets had started their afternoon rasp early, and even the wind moved with less weight. But the cabin remained quiet. The little shoes at the edge of the porch hadn't moved in weeks. Dust gathered in the weave of the welcome mat. In the air, nothing sharp, no scent of coming rain. Only the dry thrum of heat pressed into pine. Each morning Mara rose with the same ache behind her eyes, the kind that blurred time. The same knot in her throat, the same ribbon in her hand. She twisted it, untwisted it. Not to understand it, just to keep from shaking. The strand of nettle still smelled faintly of river and smoke. That smell had begun to haunt her, not because it reminded her of Willa, but because it hadn't faded. She hadn't touched Willa's sleeping mat. It remained folded by the hearth, still wrapped in the faded quilt with the bird-stitched corners. She dusted around it, never over it. Each day she placed something small beside it. An acorn cap, a clover flower, a carved button. It wasn't for mourning. It was a signal, one a mother would understand, one a child might see if she were watching from somewhere else. That morning Mara gathered her strength and arranged a row of offerings along the low wood table near the open window. Not prayers, not spells, just invitations. Honey in a clay dish, still warm from the sun, thin slices of dried apple, arranged like coins, and a small figure, hand-twisted from nettle fiber, with arms outstretched and no eyes stitched in. She placed the doll last, carefully, letting its limbs rest flat. "If you're out there," she whispered, "you'll know this is for you." Then she stepped back, wiped her hands, and left the room without turning around. That night, she didn't light the lantern. Let the dark come in on its own. She sat by the window long after the stars came out, her breathing even, her hands still. Owls passed overhead once. Something cracked in the brush near the trail, but she didn't move. When she did rise, slow and careful, it was only to latch the door gently and press her forehead against the cool wood. She didn't lock it. She hadn't locked the cabin once since Willa vanished. By morning the air was still. The forest didn't rustle. There was no wind. And when she opened the cabin door, she knew before she even looked that something had changed. The dishes on the table were empty, wiped clean. The apple slices gone. The honey dish licked dry, not messily, but smooth. And the nettle doll, gone. In its place sat a new bundle, twisted tight, green and strong. A length of nettle fiber, finer than her own hands could twist. Too clean, too even. It was braided like a thread of silk, tied at both ends with something that looked like sinew. Beside it, neatly arranged, was a spoon carved from bone, small, polished smooth, shaped by something with patience. Its handle curled slightly, like a fern tip, and under both lay a piece of alder wood, flat, no larger than a slice of bread, with the faintest carving burned into its surface. An A-frame, Willa's A-frame, the shelter by the creek. It was unmistakable. Mara's fingers hovered above the spoon. She didn't touch it. Her breath hitched. She blinked once, then again. A sound escaped her throat, something low and not quite human. Grief, recognition, relief that couldn't name itself. Later that day, when Dusty Hargrave came by and set a sack of cornmeal on the stoop without knocking, she didn't say a word. She watched him from the window. He didn't look up, just placed the sack and turned, boots silent on the dirt. He'd done that before, left things without saying anything. A jar of jam, a bundle of kindling. Now this. She opened the sack and closed it again, then went back to the table, took the bone spoon in both hands, and washed it in warm water. Not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands wanted to do something gentle. By evening, Trevino came by again. No radio this time, no report forms. Just him in his khaki uniform, dust on his collar. He stood by the porch and nodded once. She nodded back. He didn't ask any questions, just said, "Storm missed us last night." She said, "Yeah." Then he looked past her shoulder to the trees beyond the cabin and added, "Some folks in town are wondering if it's time to close the case." She didn't answer. He paused, scratched the back of his neck, then said, "If you believe otherwise, "It's all right if you stay." That was all. He left before she could respond, the crunch of his boots trailing off toward the gravel road. That night she found herself moving in slow, deliberate patterns. She boiled water for tea, lit the small oil lamp near the hearth, swept the floor twice. She wasn't expecting anything, but something in her bones felt braced. Just before sleep, she walked to the edge of the sandy path near the hemlock. The moon was half hidden behind clouds. She didn't bring a lantern. Didn't need to. Her eyes had begun to read the dark like a page. At the base of the embankment, near the place where Willa once left yarrow bundles, she saw it. A small indentation in the earth. Not quite a footprint. More like a smear. But beside it, feathers. Not dropped, not scattered. Pressed gently into the dirt, as if laid down with purpose, and caught in the side of the embankment, clinging to a dry vein of clay. A single strand of hair. Pale, fine. Too long for animal. Too short for hers. She crouched, breath slow. The humming came again. Quieter this time. A single tone, but layered. A low bass note beneath, steady as breath. And above it, faint, delicate. A second voice, a smaller one, higher pitched. Not speech, not music, just company. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Didn't need to. The air held the message. "I'm not alone, and neither are you." She walked back inside, barefoot. Her feet left damp prints on the wood. She didn't wipe them. Just stood in the doorway, letting the quiet fill her. Then, without thought, she reached for a new strand of nettle fiber, twisted it slow. Her fingers didn't shake this time. She tied the knot, not too tight. Hung it beneath the last one, the thread brushing the glass as it swayed. She didn't cry, but her throat caught. Her chest rose sharp. And as the lamp dimmed and the forest hummed its layered song, she thought she heard something else. A shift of air. A pause. A footstep just beyond the threshold. But she didn't check the door. She just listened. And somewhere in the hush of trees, someone listened back. She followed the ashes. They weren't old. Not blown out kindling from last winter's fire pit, or the powder-gray sweep left behind a cabin stove. These were different. Fresh. Still holding a faint amber glow in places. Scattered in careful lines like breadcrumbs across the forest floor. Mara hadn't seen them the day before, but when she stepped out just after dawn, drawn by the scent of punkwood smoldering in air still cold from the night, the trail was there. Thin streaks of black dust, like someone had traced the veins of the earth in coal. The hush of early winter threatened just behind the breeze, but this morning still belonged to fall. Dry leaves shivered underfoot. Hemlocks moaned soft warnings high above her head. She moved slow. Didn't bring her satchel. Left the kettle unwatched. She had learned not to pack expectation when something called. The trail weaved through the lower ridge, where the moss climbed higher on trunks, and the ground turned to sponge beneath her boots. Sometimes the ash disappeared, hidden by bramble or washed into gravel. But it always picked back up again, just when she thought it might have ended. And always leading deeper, beyond her usual path. Past where the deer tread. Past where even Dusty's oldest traps had been long abandoned. The sun rose in slants, not all the way up, as if it too was unsure if it should witness what waited ahead. At the base of a granite bluff, where lichen bloomed green over damp stone, the ash trail stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if whoever left it had no need to go further. That's when she saw the opening. It wasn't a cave, not fully. More like a pocket in the rock, tucked low where rain had carved a hollow through centuries. Moss blanketed the edges like a curtain. There was no door, just a shift in temperature, a pocket of warmth that rolled out against her cheeks, and a sound, faint, rhythmic. Breathing that didn't belong to her. Mara didn't enter. She stood at the threshold, boots sunk into wet moss, eyes adjusting to the shadow within. At first, she thought it was empty. Then she saw it. Just inside the mouth of the hollow, laid across a smooth stone slab like an offering, was a bundle of willow branches. Pale, green, supple, freshly cut, tied with reed twine, leaves still clinging. Medicine, fever remedy, carefully placed. She didn't move closer, but her breath did. It caught, as if drawn inward by the knowing. Someone had left this for her to find. Or maybe not for her, maybe just where she would. Her hands fumbled for her coat pocket. She hadn't come prepared to give, but she carried the small spoon, bone, polished, curved. The one returned to her weeks ago. And in the crook of her scarf, the edge of Willa's wool square, still soft with the scent of the old cabin stove. She held both gently, laid them down on a flat stone near the opening. Spoon first, then the scarf. Her hand lingered a second longer, pressing the wool into the stone. That was all she had. From the depth of the hollow, a sound stirred. Not a growl, not a word. Just a shift in breath, deeper now. Then, another sound. Softer, a whisper of rhythm. A child's breathing, not hurried, not struggling, just real. Her knees almost buckled. Willa. No voice called her name. No hand reached out. But the sound pierced something in her chest that had been knotted tight for months. A rope that snapped in silence. Her lips trembled. She swallowed the cry that tried to break free. She stayed still. Didn't enter. Didn't dare. Snowflakes began to drift, though the sky hadn't fully opened. Just a few, like the forest was testing winter's tongue. She wrapped her arms around herself. The scarf on the stone soaked quickly. She didn't move to retrieve it. Inside the cave, another sound began to rise. Humming. Not a tone this time, but a blend. A harmony. Rich, layered, not loud. Male voices, perhaps? Throaty, but warm. Then another, higher, thin and soft. Like a child joining in, unsure at first, then bolder. The rhythm wasn't human. It curved too deep, dipped too slow. But it was beautiful. The kind of sound that didn't need a name. It spoke to marrow. It filled empty rooms inside the body where language couldn't go. Her eyes stung, and she understood then. This was not a place to be entered. This was not her fire to sit beside. This was someone else's hearth, and she had been allowed only to listen. She stepped back, one foot, then another. Never turned her back. Snow fell heavier now, quiet as breath. Her boots left no tracks on the moss, only dim impressions that would fade before midday. She paused at the first clearing, looked back once. The entrance had already disappeared into the stone, as if it had never opened at all. By nightfall, the cold set in hard. The cabin walls creaked with it. The wind pressed tight against the shutters. Mara added a second log to the stove, wrapped herself in the old quilt, and listened. No owls tonight, no night creatures. But in the quiet, the humming still echoed. Inside her chest, long after it had stopped, she reached for the sewing basket, found the tiny hole in Willa's sweater near the hem, the one that had been there before the river, before the flood, before everything. She patched it slowly, the thread thick from being rewound so many times. Her hands didn't shake. Not tonight. When the patch was done, she folded the sweater. Not as an offering, not as a relic, but as something living, something waiting. Then, without thinking, she reached for a strand of nettle, the last of the old batch, twisted it slow, made a knot, this one tighter, not with urgency, but with trust. She opened the door. Cold rushed in. The sky was cloudless, stars scattered like seeds. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, the cold biting her toes, and tied the knot beneath the others, just below the last one Willa had helped her make. The new knot swayed, a small movement, then it stilled. And far off, From the ridge above the cabin came the faintest vibration. A low breath, a rustling shift in rhythm, like someone acknowledging, like someone keeping watch. Spring came back first with birds. Not with warmth, not yet, but with sound. Finches calling over the fields too early for buds, hawks gliding low like scouts sent ahead of the green. The forest still held frost under its ribs, but the creek had begun to soften, ice thinned by days just long enough for light to touch the roots again. Mara stood at the edge of the cabin garden, rake in hand, watching the soil breathe. That year someone left a gift, a pouch made of bark, bound with willow twine, placed flat on the low table by the window where the morning sun reached best. No noise, no shadow, just presence. Inside the pouch were seeds, smooth, round, cream-colored with a line of rust red circling the eye. Beans, more than a dozen. She didn't plant them right away. She held them in her palm for hours, warming them like bird eggs. Then she walked down to the edge of the clearing, where the sun lasted longer, and dug her fingers into the dirt. Her hands moved without blueprint. The beans dropped into earth. When she finished, she tied a knot, one strand of nettle, dipped in clay-colored dye from last fall's root harvest. She tied it around a bent stake and walked away. When the plants came up 2 weeks later, she whispered to them. Not far from the edge of the cabin, a wire snare had been set. She hadn't placed it, hadn't seen it. It had rusted halfway into the brush, forgotten by whoever left it. A young doe lay caught in the curve, bleeding from the ankle, eyes wide with confusion, but no fight left. Mara approached slow. She spoke soft. It took nearly an hour to free the animal. She left plantain wrapped in cotton nearby in case it returned. The next morning on the porch, she found a jar. Small, handmade, red clay. Still warm. She unscrewed the lid and lifted the rim to her nose. The scent hit first. Mint, licorice, something deeper underneath. A cough tonic, thick, earthy. Exactly what her lungs had started to need as the cold turned inward. She hadn't told anyone she was sick, but someone had noticed. She lit the stove and drank it slow. By summer's end, the nettle knots hung in a line like prayers. The next spring, she walked past the hemlock and found a feather caught in the bark. Pale brown, striped. Near it, someone had cleared leaves away from a stone, flat and wide, meant for sitting. She left a small cup of apple vinegar nearby, with a slice of dried pear. The cup was gone the next day. In its place, a shard of bone, hollowed and sanded, no longer than a matchstick. She didn't understand it at first. Then she turned it in her hand. It was a whistle, tuned not for sound, but for breath. She placed it on the shelf beside the spoon. When fall returned with brittle air and smoke in the hills, Dusty came by with a sack of nails and left them on the porch. Said nothing, just nodded and tipped his cap. She thanked him anyway. He knew. Trevino stopped coming as often. When he did, it was never to ask. He walked the perimeter once, checked the back trail, then left. Once, he carved into a tree near the ridge. Dead end. Then planted a signpost beside it. Landslide risk, it read. There'd been no landslide, but no one followed the path after that. Through the seasons, the sharing changed. It deepened. One winter, a bundle of dried moss was left on her doorstep, tied tight with a strip of bark, tucked inside a nest of curled fern. Mara didn't recognize the species. It wasn't from around the cabin. She placed it in boiling water, let the steam fill the house. That night, her fever broke. A new knot was tied. By 1992, the line of nettle knots had started to curve. She added wood hooks across the cabin's outer beam to hold more. Some were tied with dyed fiber, others with pressed leaves wrapped around the center. Each had its own weight, its own reason. A silent story that only she and the trees seemed to remember. People in town stopped asking. They had their own theories. Some said she'd lost her grip. Others whispered about rituals. But they kept their distance. The forest had begun to reclaim the road to her cabin. Mail stopped. No one pressed further. The gifts, however, never stopped. That year, when she found a coyote cub near the creek, tangled in a fishing line and half-starved, she didn't hesitate. She brought it inside, fed it goat milk warmed over coals, soothed its whimpers, released it a week later. Left behind in its place, just outside her window, was a pile of bark flakes shaped like scales, curved, layered, arranged in the shape of a sleeping animal. A message, maybe. A memory. Dusty started leaving things more often. A tin lantern with a cracked pane. A jar of ground corn. He never asked, just offered. His bell, made from old spoons, hung from a cedar beam above the porch. When it rang soft in winter wind, it sounded like someone remembering. One night, late December, someone knocked at the door. Not with knuckles, a branch, just once, then silence. She opened the door. Found nothing. But on the step, a stone. Smooth, round, warm, as if held for a long time by something with thick palms. She carried it inside and held it all night. Years passed like water through soil. Quiet, steady, always moving underneath. The line of knots grew long. The cedar beam bowed slightly from the weight. But she never took one down, only added. Each knot was a moment, a message, a bond, and each one taught her a new word in the language she was learning. The language of listening, the language of trust, the language of those who care without needing to be seen. It started with a sky that wouldn't sit still, the kind that built up pressure behind the clouds like breath caught too long in a tight chest. Mara had seen spring storms before. She knew how the moss darkened just before rain hit, how the birds fell quiet in their nests, how the fir needles curled inward like they were bracing. But this one didn't just threaten thunder. It carried weight, a feeling that something underneath the ground was about to move. She was returning from the high ridge where plantain grew wild, a basket half full, boots thick with mud. The forest had turned loud with the sound of dripping branches, but not from rain, just sweat from the air. Hot, heavy, still, the kind of air that warned before it broke. She paused halfway down the slope to catch her breath. That's when she saw them. 2 sets of footprints in the soft volcanic mud. One large, deep, heavy at the heel. The other smaller, narrower, almost tender in their step. They ran side by side for about 10 yards, then veered west toward the basalt wall above the old quarry line. The moss had been scraped in places. She crouched, fingers brushing the surface. Alder leaves freshly broken. A small tuft of fur. The wind pushed hair against her face. She stayed low, eyes narrowed. Then a sound, sharp, wrong, cracking like bone splitting under sudden pressure. And thunder answered. The ridge shook. A burst of movement pulled her toward the edge. She scrambled through the brush, ignoring the sting of nettles and dry branches tearing her sleeves. The forest opened fast into exposed slope, the kind that held only stubborn grass and pitted rock. And then, without warning, the slope let go. Earth cracked, a tree shifted sideways, and a curl of granite broke free, rolling slow at first, then faster, tearing through the understory with a sound like the sky coughing stones. It took seconds, but when it stopped, the edge of the bluff had changed. A shallow ledge had collapsed, pulling with it loose roots, old vines, and a portion of the upper slope. Just below that ledge, half tucked into what used to be a hidden crease in the land, lay the sliver of a familiar shape. Smooth, curved, stone-backed, the outer frame of the rock hollow. The breathing place. Her breath caught hard in her throat. It hadn't collapsed entirely, but it was exposed now. Too exposed. A shift of wind, a wrong glance, One more storm, and the whole thing would open like a cut. She stood frozen. Her basket had tipped, herbs scattered. She didn't pick them up. Just stared at the wound in the hillside, heart hammering loud enough to feel in her gums. Then she heard it. Voices. Not speaking. Not human. A low hum, drawn long and strained, coming from below the break. Slower than she remembered. Mournful, even. Not a warning. A lament. Behind her, further up the slope, she heard movement. Not from the earth. From boots. From men. She turned. 2 figures in camo jackets, one with a hatchet strapped to his thigh, another with a camera around his neck. They weren't from Vida. She didn't know them. And they were too close. Her body moved before her brain did. She slid downhill, catching the ridge in a crouch, heart high in her chest. The men hadn't seen her yet, but they would. The path they were following would lead straight to the downed ridge. No time. She bolted sideways, cut through the narrow pine belt and climbed until her legs ached. She didn't yell, didn't wave. She found the marker Dusty had left the year before, an old flag taped to a stake meant for timber counting. She grabbed it and ran east. 10 minutes later, the sound of a gas engine rattled through the trees. Dusty. His voice came first, muttering, loud, fake casual. Then the clatter of something heavy dropped on metal. She reached him just as he kicked on the generator. "What's this for?" he shouted into the trees, too loud. "Forgot I left this junk up here." The noise tore through the air like a drill. High, pointless, perfect. The men on the ridge turned, wandered toward the sound. Dusty tossed an old chain down, slammed the hood of the truck. The men asked if there was a construction crew up here. He told them nope, just cleaning out an old shed. Nothing to see. Private land. One of them grunted. The other laughed. They turned. They didn't come back. Later, when the sun dipped and the wind returned in low pulses, Mara came back to the ridge. The mouth of the cave was still half covered by ferns and ash root. But the footprint trail was gone. In its place were markings. Not letters, not words, but arrangements. Sticks bent at angles, mud pressed in leaf shapes. And in the shallow slope above the broken ledge, woven through alder branches, were thin cords of vine, tight, bracing the outer edge like stitches over a split seam. They were repairing it. She stood there watching, breath in her throat. Behind the vines, movement, slow, large, brown fur glinting under broken sunlight. 2 pairs of arms, one adult, one smaller, working without voice, bending branches, pressing bark, layering moss. Their backs to her. No fear, only focus. The smaller one reached up, was handed a stone. They pressed it into the slope together. The wind lifted briefly, carried with it the smell of wet cedar. Mara stepped back. She couldn't help. Not this time. She turned slowly, left the ridge, and walked home. The next morning the clouds hung low again, threatening more rain. Her fingers trembled as she opened the cupboard. Inside was her wooden notebook, the one she had carved herself years ago. Pages sealed with wax. On it were drawn every trail, every ridge, every mark she'd followed. She flipped through it. The drawings of alder groves, the map of Brush Creek's bends, the coordinates of the hollow. Then she lit a match, tossed it in. The flame caught slow, but it caught. The pages darkened, curled, broke inward like wings collapsing. She watched until the fire turned to black ash, then gathered the remains into a tin bowl, carried it into the trees. At the base of a fallen log, where the moss grew thick and the stones stayed cold year-round, she scattered the ash with both hands. Let it sink, let it vanish. That night she sat on the porch again. Didn't tie a new knot, didn't say a word, but the wind came soft across the slope, humming in a long breath across the wood beams. It held a new rhythm, slower, grateful, and somewhere in that breath, something whispered without voice. You kept the secret. The wind carried the scent of dry needles and sun-warmed bark that morning. Hemlock branches stirred slow, brushing the sky with fingers that had seen 10 years of seasons pass in silence. The forest didn't feel heavy anymore. It breathed easy, as if waiting for something not with fear, but with grace. Mara stood near the edge of the clearing, boots sunk into soft earth, the last of the summer's warmth clinging to her sleeves. Her eyes were already fixed ahead, even before the sound came. Not footsteps, stillness, then motion. And there, just past the bend where the nettle patches grew tall and wild, stood a figure, lean, unmoving, half-shadowed by the trees. Not a dream, not a vision. Her spine knew it before her breath did. Her hand pressed gently to her ribs as the shape stepped forward into the golden hush. A girl, 14, maybe 15, tall, thin as reed but rooted like stone. Her hair fell in a long braid over her shoulder, knotted not with string, but with dried grass. Around her neck, a cord of alder shells strung in uneven rhythm. Her shirt was stitched with fiber, not thread. Her skin dusted with ash. Her eyes met Mara's. Not surprised, not afraid. Deep, grounded. Like the riverbed beneath the current. She said nothing. Neither did Mara. The wind shifted, curled around them, lifted a curl of dust and twirled it gently, like the forest itself bowed in quiet. Mara stepped forward, only one step. The girl didn't move. Then, like a slow wave pushing outward, a memory unfurled. Of braiding nettle, of pressing leaves into palms, of quiet humming behind a wall of ferns, of a name whispered against bark. Willa. Mara's knees almost gave out, but she didn't fall. Willa stood firm, hands by her sides, no tears, no shaking. She was not lost. She had never been lost. She had only walked further into the trees than Mara had dared, and now she had chosen to return. Mara spoke, not with words, but with her chest. Barely a nod, barely a breath. Willa blinked once, then stepped closer. One step. That was enough. Later, inside the cabin, Mara boiled water with hands that couldn't stop trembling. Willa sat on the floor, not on a chair, back straight, legs crossed the way she'd once sat by the stream to collect rocks. She didn't reach for the cup. Mara didn't press it. They let the steam fill the space between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than Mara remembered. Not hoarse, not cold, just measured. She told the story in pieces, not linearly, like moss spreading over time. How, on the day of the flood, she had been swept sideways, not under, caught by an arm, not human, lifted from water to rock, from fear to silence. How she had been led, not dragged, not stolen. How Hearth-Mother had pressed warm stone to her chest that first night, her fur smelling of old smoke and river salt. She said the forest did not speak in words. It taught in gestures, in rituals, in watching. She learned when to walk, when to crouch, how to wrap cedar bark for fever, how to listen to the breath of trees. She said River Watcher watched her first, then allowed her to follow, then let her help. How her hands grew strong, her feet sure. She learned to read the clouds not for rain, but for omen. Learned to name the cries of birds not by pitch, but by meaning. She said she didn't miss speaking. Not really. Not until she dreamed of a firelight shape sewing a patch on a small sweater. That shape hummed. And in that sound, Willa remembered her own name. But it wasn't memory that brought her back. It was a choice. Before leaving the hollow, there was a rite. Not of words, of stillness. She stood in the center of the inner chamber, where the walls curled like ribs. Around her the tribe, 3 large shapes, one elder, one adolescent, one nearly her height. They formed a circle. No one moved, no one touched, just breathing. The air grew thick. The hum began, not from the mouths, but from within. A vibration that filled the cave. Low, deep, growing. Willa stood inside it, eyes closed, and she waited. The test was not whether she would flinch or run. It was whether her heart would remain still. If it leapt, if it followed the song, she would stay. If it held, she would go. She did not cry. She did not tremble. Her chest stayed steady. When the song stopped, she opened her eyes. They had already turned away. They had let her go. But she carried their silence in her spine. And now, sitting on the cabin floor, she did not belong to one world or the other. She belonged to both. She rose without being asked, stepped onto the porch. Beneath the tangle of old nettle knots, she pulled a new strand from her pocket, one braided with fine bark, nettle, and a sliver of fur. She tied it herself, didn't look back, but stood there a long while, hand over her chest. Mara watched from the doorway. Her own hand pressed the same way. 2 figures, 2 hearts, same rhythm. From the forest, a hum returned. Not loud, not singular, not farewell, but a line held taut in the air, a chord across the distance, and neither of them flinched. They just breathed together, and the trees listened. The light turned sharper near the end of October, the kind that slipped in sideways under the cedar eaves and caught on dust like it was trying to write something down. Mara stood in the doorway with a chisel in one hand, a rough split of fur balanced on her hip. The mornings had begun to hold frost in the weeds again, but the afternoons still carried warmth enough to keep the bees lazy. The air smelled of sap and stone, and from the edge of the field, she could hear Willa humming something low under her breath. Not a tune, a rhythm. The girl was kneeling in the clearing, palms flat on a board. Dusty had brought it that morning, hauled it in on his shoulder with a quiet nod, said it was left over from a porch job up near Mackenzie Bridge. She hadn't asked for it, but he knew. Dusty always seemed to know when something needed starting. Now Willa traced the lines of grain with her finger, like she was following a river's path on a map. Mara stepped down, boots quiet on the cold ground, and knelt beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then they began. The knife slid slow across the wood, not carving deeply, just coaxing shapes to the surface. First came the curve of a woman's back, bent like a hill beneath winter wind. Then, beside her, a child, not clinging but standing. And behind them, rising like shadows turned shelter, 2 larger shapes, broad arms stretched wide, not to block, but to hold. Mara wiped sawdust from her sleeve. Willa pressed her thumb into one corner, left an imprint in the knot of the grain. By dusk, the relief was half-formed. They leaned it against the porch rail and stepped back, let it watch the stars rise. Later that night, after the kettle had cooled and the cabin had settled into creaks and sighs, Willa opened the door without a word. She walked out barefoot, hair loose down her back. The wind didn't bite. It welcomed her. At the edge of the porch, she crouched low. In her hands, a small parcel wrapped in cloth. She unrolled it slow. Inside, dried yarrow, curled plantain leaves, a palm-sized stone worn smooth from river polish, and a soft handful of fur. Not much, but enough. She placed them one by one into a shallow dish of bark she had made that spring, pressing each item with care. A bundle of use, a basket of memory. Mara watched from the threshold, heart slow, hands wrapped around a tin cup that had gone cold in her grasp. Her daughter, moved like she had never been away, like the rhythms of offering and thanks had sunk into her marrow. And when Willa stood and turned, there was no performance in her face, no pride, just quiet. Her hand rose slightly and pressed once over her chest. Not dramatic, just deliberate. Then, the first sound, soft but real. From deep in her chest, Willa let out a single note. It vibrated more than rang. It wasn't perfect. It trembled, but it hummed. Right frequency, right shape. Like her chest remembered a language that her throat had only just learned. And the forest answered, not all at once, not with clarity, but with something low and warm and wide. A hum that didn't come from one place. It came from below, from behind, from the slope, from the dark line where the trees met the wind. Willa didn't flinch. She just breathed. Mara stepped out onto the porch and stood beside her. The cold hadn't touched her. She felt only a warmth rising from somewhere she couldn't name. She reached slowly for the spindle of nettle that had hung beneath the eaves since before Willa was born. The knots had faded, the strings frayed. But this night needed one more. Her fingers worked the fiber slow. Old habit, but Willa reached over and stopped her. Instead, the girl took a fresh strand from her own pouch, twined with bark, and a single loop of hair the color of frost. She held it out. Mara tied it, hung it with care. It caught the light of the lantern and danced. They didn't sleep early that night. At the edge of the clearing, where the willows leaned over the creek, they placed the carving. Not in the center, not for show. Just nestled beneath the arch of roots where Willa had once vanished. The ground had softened again from recent rain. Mara knelt and pressed her palms into the mud to steady the relief as Willa set it in place. Behind them, the forest waited. From across the slope, headlights blinked once. A quiet vehicle paused at the gravel split. Trevino. He never got out now. Just sat a while, engine idle, watching from a respectful distance. Then he turned around. A silent vow still kept. By morning, the carving had darkened where the dew touched it. The figures looked almost like they were breathing. A single crow landed on the railing and tilted its head. From the trees came no sound, just stillness, the kind that followed trust. Later that day, Mara gathered the bowl that Willa had used, placed it beneath the porch bench beside the old tin spoon, the clay jar, and the bone whistle. Nothing labeled, nothing explained, but everything there meant something. And in the corner of the porch, tied now from a second beam built with Willa's hands, hung a new strand of knots. Not just nettle anymore. Some were braided with moss, others with dried hair from the brush, one with a tuft of cottonwood silk pressed in, and near the very end, still green, still soft, a loop made by two hands together. No longer mother alone, not child alone, a pair, a we. And somewhere beneath the porch, tucked quiet in earth that had held both footprints and prayer. The old rhythms hummed softer now, almost like they were resting, but not ending. From the woods, a breeze curled slow through the clearing, brushing past the hemlock and through the knots with a hush. No words, but meaning. And the last sound left hanging in the air wasn't a goodbye. It was a breath being held, ready for the next call. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand victories or loud declarations, but about the quiet threads that bind us together. Threads of care, of patience, of trust built slowly, without asking for recognition. Somewhere between silence and survival, between breath and belonging, there lives a kind of love that doesn't demand to be seen. It simply gives, and waits, and gives again. In a world that rushes to explain, to categorize, to claim, there's something sacred about what remains unnamed, about gestures exchanged without words, about offerings left without expectation. We often forget that not all bonds are forged in light. Some are grown in shadow, in the damp quiet of understanding, nurtured by time, shaped by mutual reverence. And sometimes, the deepest connections are the ones made when no one else is watching. This wasn't a tale of fear or fantasy. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to what we often overlook, that care is a language, and kindness, when repeated without condition, becomes a legacy, that the earth listens, that the unheard take notice, and that healing does not always arrive with noise, but with footsteps that leave no trail, and songs that speak not to the ears, but to the marrow. There are those who choose to listen more than they speak, to tend more than they take, and in doing so, they leave behind something enduring. Not monuments, not names, but a kind of knowing, a shared rhythm, a steady hum that reminds us we're not alone. that reciprocity still matters, that gratitude can be tied, one knot at a time, and maybe, just maybe, if we choose to live like that, aware, attentive, willing to give without needing applause, we become part of something larger than ourselves, something older, wiser, quieter, but no less alive. Thank you for being here, for sharing this space, and for letting this story breathe through you. If it stirred something in you, an old memory, a forgotten feeling, a quiet hope, I invite you to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what this story meant to you, in your own words. And if you'd like to walk alongside us on more journeys like this, please consider subscribing, sharing, and helping keep these stories alive. Until next time, take care of what's small, listen for what's soft, and never underestimate the power of a thank you left hanging quietly in the wind.